"You don't belong here," the judge shouted at the elderly black homeowner. Moments later, when a young lawyer stood up from the crowd, everyone witnessed something they'd never forget. The watering can trembled in Walter Johnson's weathered hands as he shuffled between the rose bushes. Water splashed onto his worn brown shoes, darkening the leather. The morning sun beat down on his neck while he worked through Sarah's garden, just like he had every morning since she passed. "Talking to them roses again, old man?" The voice made Walter's shoulders tense. He didn't turn around. He knew it was Bill Henderson from next door, probably standing at his fence like he did most mornings, watching. "They need the conversation to grow proper," Walter said quietly, continuing to water the white roses Sarah had planted 30 years ago. His wife had always said plants needed more than just water and sunlight. They needed love too. "Yeah, well, we'll see how much longer you'll be having those conversations," Bill muttered, just loud enough for Walter to hear. Walter's hand tightened around the watering can handle, but he kept his eyes on the roses. The mail truck's familiar rumble approached down the street. Walter watched from the corner of his eye as Kevin, the mailman who'd been working this route for the past 5 years, stopped at his box. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," Kevin called out, holding an official-looking envelope. "Got something here needs signing." Walter set down his watering can and wiped his palms on his tan work pants. As he walked to the mailbox, he noticed Bill Henderson disappearing into his house. The screen door slammed shut behind him. "What you got there, Kevin?" Walter asked, taking the pen being offered. "Certified letter. Sir Court summons by the looks of it." Kevin's usual smile had faded. "Need your signature right here." Walter's hand shook slightly as he signed. Sarah had always handled the official papers. In their 47 years of marriage, she'd taken care of every bill, every document, every piece of paperwork that came their way. She'd been gone 6 months now, and Walter still found himself turning to tell her about things before remembering she wasn't there. Back in his kitchen, Walter sat at the small round table where he and Sarah had shared thousands of meals. The envelope felt heavy in his hands. He could hear Bill Henderson's voice drifting through the open window, talking to someone on his phone. "Yeah, it's being delivered right now. Old man's getting his papers." Walter's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The legal language swam before his eyes, but certain phrases jumped out at him. Complaint of property damage, disputed ownership, preliminary hearing. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Walter got up and moved to Sarah's old desk in the corner of the living room. The dark wood was still polished, just like she'd always kept it. He pulled open the top drawer where she'd stored all their important papers. "Should be right here," he muttered, rifling through folders. "You always kept everything right here, Sarah." But the property deed wasn't in its usual place. Walter opened another drawer, then another. Papers rustled as his movements became more frantic. Outside, he could hear voices, neighbors gathering, talking in low tones. The sun was setting by the time Walter had searched every drawer, every folder, every box in the house. His back ached from bending over boxes in the attic. Dust covered his clothes. The property deed, the one Sarah had shown him just last year when they'd updated their will, was nowhere to be found. Walter sank into his armchair. The court summons crumpled in his hand. The street lights were coming on outside, casting long shadows through the windows. In the growing darkness, he could see shapes moving behind the curtains of the Henderson house next door. The phone rang, startling him. Walter reached for it, hope fluttering in his chest. Maybe it was their son James, calling from Chicago like he sometimes did on Sunday evenings. "Johnson residence," he answered. "Mr. Johnson." The voice was unfamiliar, cold. "This is Patricia Myers from the county clerk's office. I'm calling to confirm your court appearance tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Do not be late." Walter's throat felt dry. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there. Make sure you bring all relevant property documentation with you," she added, then hung up without waiting for his response. The dial tone hummed in Walter's ear. He slowly placed the phone back in its cradle, his hand lingering on the receiver. Sarah had always said documentation was everything. "Keep your papers in order," she'd tell him, "because the world won't take your word for it." In the kitchen, the clock ticked loudly. Walter could hear the Hendersons' television through the thin walls, the sound of a game show audience cheering. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at Sarah's garden in the darkness. The roses were just silhouettes now, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. A car drove by slowly, too slowly. Walter recognized it as belonging to the Petersons from 3 houses down. They'd never driven that slowly past his house before Sarah died. The court summons on his armchair seemed to glow in the darkness, the official seal catching what little light came through the windows. Walter picked it up again, reading it for the 100th time, willing the words to make sense. His fingers found the old brass key in his pocket, the one to Sarah's desk. He pulled it out, turning it over in his palm. She'd given it to him the week before she passed, her hand weak but insistent as she pressed it into his palm. "Everything you need is in there," she told him. "I've kept it all safe." But now, standing in their dark living room with only the sound of the clock and distant television for company, Walter Johnson realized that for the first time in 50 years, he didn't feel safe in his own home. And tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., he would have to face whatever was coming alone. He walked back to the garden one last time that night. The roses were just shapes in the darkness, but he knew every bush, every branch. His fingers found a bloom, gentle against the soft petals. "What do I do now, Sarah?" he whispered into the night. "What do I do?" Only the distant sound of traffic answered him. Inside the Henderson house, lights flicked off one by one. Walter stood in his garden until the night air grew cool enough to make him shiver, then slowly made his way back inside, leaving Sarah's roses to the darkness. The court summons lay on his kitchen table all night, while Walter sat in Sarah's chair, watching the hours tick by on the old clock above the stove. By morning, he hadn't slept, and the paper was wrinkled from his hands, reading it over and over, trying to understand what he had done wrong in a house that had been his home for half a century. The Memphis courthouse loomed against the morning sky, its stone steps already crowded with people by the time Walter arrived. His best suit, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, felt tight around his collar. He clutched his worn leather briefcase, empty except for the wrinkled court summons and a handful of old photographs. "ID," the security guard barked as Walter approached the metal detector. The guard, a young man with a crew cut, barely glanced at Walter's driver's license before pointing to the conveyor belt. "Empty your pockets. Remove your belt." Walter's hands shook as he placed his belongings in the plastic bin. Behind him, a group of lawyers in crisp suits walked through another line, nodding to the guards who waved them through without stopping. The metal detector beeped when Walter walked through. "Arms out," the guard ordered, grabbing his wand detector. He ran it roughly over Walter's body, lingering longer than necessary. "What's in your jacket pocket?" "Just my reading glasses," Walter said quietly. "Take them out. Show me." Walter fumbled with his pocket, while people in line behind him sighed impatiently. His glasses case clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished marble. "Pick it up," the guard said. "And hurry it up." A young woman in a business suit reached down and handed Walter his case. Her eyes were kind, but she quickly looked away and hurried past. The courthouse hallway stretched out like a maze. Walter checked his summons again. Courtroom 3B. His dress, shoes echoed on the marble floor as he searched for directions. "Can I help you find something?" A clerk behind a desk asked without looking up from her computer. "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for courtroom 3B. I have a hearing at 9. The clerk glanced up, her eyes scanning Walter before returning to her screen. "Take the elevator to the 3rd floor. Turn right. Can't miss it." The elevator was packed with lawyers and their clients. Walter squeezed into the corner, trying to make himself smaller. The conversations around him died as soon as he entered. "3rd floor," the elevator announced in a mechanical voice. Walter shuffled out, following the signs to courtroom 3B. Bill Henderson was already there, standing with a group of neighbors outside the courtroom doors. They went quiet when they saw Walter. "Look who decided to show up," Bill said loudly. He was wearing a new suit, his gray hair freshly cut. Next to him, Mrs. Peterson from down the street clutched her purse tighter. Walter moved to sit on a bench away from the group, but their whispers followed him. "Can you believe he's still trying to fight this? Should have taken the offer when he had the chance. Some people just don't know when to quit." The courtroom doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock. A bailiff stood at attention as people filed in. All rise. The bailiff called out as Judge Thompson entered. The Honorable Judge Richard Thompson presiding. The judge was a tall man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes. He sat down heavily in his chair, not bothering to look at the gathered people as he shuffled through papers on his desk. Case number 47293, Henderson et al. Versus Johnson, the bailiff announced. Property dispute and vandalism charges. Walter's heart pounded as he made his way to the defendant's table. He'd graded thousands of papers during his teaching career, but these legal documents in front of him might as well have been written in a foreign language. Mr. Johnson, Judge Thompson's voice cut through the air. Where is your legal representation? Walter stood up slowly. I don't have a lawyer, Your Honor. I couldn't. Speak up, the judge interrupted. This is a courtroom, not a funeral. Someone snickered behind Walter. He cleared his throat. I said I don't have a lawyer. Sir, I couldn't afford one on my pension. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his chair creaking. And you expect this court to accommodate your lack of preparation? No, sir, yes, sir, Walter's hands gripped the edge of the table. I have some pictures, documents that show. Are you attempting to enter evidence without proper filing procedures? The judge's voice rose. Did you submit these documents to the clerk's office within the required time frame? Walter's mouth went dry. I didn't know about any time frame, Your Honor. My wife usually handled. Your personal circumstances are not this court's concern, Mr. Johnson. Judge Thompson turned to where Bill Henderson sat with his lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit. Counsel, present your case. Henderson's lawyer stood smoothly. Your Honor, my clients have documented numerous instances of property damage and code violations. Mr. Johnson's neglect of his property has adversely affected the entire neighborhood's value. Furthermore, we have evidence suggesting the property's ownership is in question. That's not true. Walter burst out. That house has been in my family for... You will speak when addressed by this court. Judge Thompson's gavel crashed down. One more outburst, and I'll have you removed. Walter sank back into his chair. The room seemed to spin around him as Henderson's lawyer continued talking, showing photographs of his house, presenting documents Walter had never seen before. And here, Your Honor, you can see the state of disrepair. The lawyer pointed to a photo of Sarah's garden. These overgrown bushes are a violation of City Code 47.3. Those are my wife's roses, Walter said softly. Judge Thompson's hand slammed down on his desk. Mr. Johnson, this is your final warning. But they're lying. Walter stood up, his voice stronger now. Those roses aren't overgrown. Sarah tended them every day until she... You are not welcome here. Judge Thompson's voice thundered through the courtroom. He stood up, his robe billowing as he pointed at Walter. This is a court of law, not your backyard. One more word, and I'll have you held in contempt. The silence that followed was deafening. Walter could feel every eye in the courtroom on him. Bill Henderson was smirking. Mrs. Peterson had her hand over her mouth. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, Henderson's lawyer smoothly interjected. Given Mr. Johnson's behavior, we request an immediate inspection of the property and temporary restraining order. Granted, Judge Thompson cut in, still glaring at Walter. Mr. Johnson, you have 48 hours to produce proper documentation of ownership and bring your property up to code. Failure to do so will result in immediate forfeiture. Do you understand? Walter's legs felt weak. 48 hours? But I need time to... Do. You. Understand? Each word fell like a hammer. Yes, Your Honor, Walter whispered. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. People began filing out of the courtroom. Walter remained standing at his table, his empty briefcase forgotten at his feet. Bill Henderson walked past, bumping Walter's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. Told you we'd see how long those conversations with your roses would last, Henderson muttered. The courtroom emptied quickly, leaving Walter alone with his reflection in the polished wood of the table. 48 hours. The words echoed in his head as he slowly picked up his briefcase. Outside the courtroom, the hallway had already filled with new people, new cases. No one looked at Walter as he made his way back to the elevator, back through security, back down the stone steps. The morning sun was harsh now, making him squint as he stood on the courthouse steps. Somewhere in the city, Sarah's roses were waiting for their morning water. But for the first time in 50 years, Walter Johnson wasn't sure he'd be there to give it to them. Walter's hands trembled on the steering wheel of his old Buick as he pulled into his driveway. The dashboard clock read 10:47 a.m. 45 hours and 13 minutes left. The roses needed watering. He could see them drooping in the late morning heat, but there wasn't time. Not now. He hurried up the front steps, his keys scraping against the lock in his haste. The house felt different now. Every creaking floorboard, every faded wallpaper seemed to mock him. Walter went straight to Sarah's desk, pulling drawers open with shaking hands. "Come on," he muttered, rifling through folders. "Has to be here somewhere." The phone rang, making him jump. Walter grabbed it, hope rising in his chest. "James?" "Mr. Johnson." It was Bill Henderson's voice. "Just wanted to make sure you understood what the judge said." 48 hours. Walter's grip tightened on the receiver. "I heard him just fine, Bill." "Good. Hate to see anything happen to those precious roses of yours." The line went dead. Walter slowly put the phone down, his jaw clenched. He turned back to the desk, emptying drawers onto the floor. Tax returns from 1982. Sarah's teaching certificates. Their marriage license, yellowed with age. But no property deed. The doorbell rang. Walter ignored it, moving to the hall closet where Sarah kept more files in old shoe boxes. The bell rang again, more insistent. "Mr. Johnson?" A woman's voice called through the door. "It's Margaret from next door. Can we talk?" Walter opened the door cautiously. Margaret Wilson stood on his porch, wringing her hands. She'd lived next door for 30 years, had brought them casseroles when Sarah got sick. "What is it, Margaret?" She glanced over her shoulder nervously. "I wanted to tell you. I remember when you and Sarah moved in. I remember the paper she showed me, the deed with your grandfather's name on it." "You do?" Walter's heart leaped. "Would you tell that to the judge?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I can't, Walter. Bill Henderson, he's on the neighborhood council now. My Tommy needs their approval for his new garage addition, and—" She backed away. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Walter watched her hurry down his walkway, her head down. Another door closed on him. Inside, he grabbed the phone again, dialing a number he knew by heart but rarely called. "You've reached James Johnson. Leave a message." "James?" Walter's voice cracked. "Son, I need your help. They're trying to take the house. Your mother's house. Please call me back." He hung up, knowing his son's voicemail box was probably full of similar messages. James hadn't even come to Sarah's funeral. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Walter searched every inch of the house. He found old photos of his parents on the front porch, his grandfather in his Sunday best standing proudly by the rose bushes he'd planted. But no deed. At 6:23 p.m., he drove to the county records office, arriving just as the clerk was locking up. "Please," Walter said, holding up his ID. "I just need to check the property records." The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, looked at his watch. "We open at 8 a.m. tomorrow, but I only have until tomorrow afternoon to 8 a.m., the clerk repeated, walking to his car. Walter sat in his Buick, watching the sunset paint the government building orange. 38 hours left. He drove home slowly, his mind racing. The street lights were coming on as he pulled up to his house. A police car drove by slowly, the officer watching him with suspicious eyes. The roses needed watering. Walter grabbed the old watering can, his movements automatic after years of routine. The water splashed over his shoes as his hands shook. "Sarah," he whispered to the roses, "where did you put it? Where's the deed?" "Talking to yourself again, old man?" Walter turned. Bill Henderson stood at his fence, a beer in his hand. "Just tended to my wife's garden, Bill. Not for much longer." Henderson took a long drink. "You know, this could all go away. My offer to buy still stands, though the price might have gone down a bit since this morning." Walter straightened up slowly, his back protesting. "This house isn't for sale, Bill. Never has been. Everything's for sale, Johnson. Just depends on how much pressure you can take." Walter watched Henderson walk back into his house, the screen door slamming behind him. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, their petals catching the last light of day. Inside, Walter picked up the phone again. "James? It's Dad again. I know you're busy. I know you haven't wanted to. But son, they're trying to take your mother's roses. The house where you learned to walk. Please." The answering machine cut him off. Walter sat in Sarah's chair, surrounded by scattered papers, watching the clock tick away his time. At midnight, he drove to the all-night diner where he and Sarah used to have Sunday breakfast. The waitress, young enough to be his granddaughter, brought him coffee without asking. "You okay, sugar?" she asked, noting his suit, now wrinkled from hours of searching. "Just thinking," Walter said, staring into his coffee cup. "Must be some heavy thoughts." Walter looked up at her young face. So much life ahead of her. "Have you ever lost something? Something so important that without it, you might lose everything else?" She topped off his coffee. "My grandma used to say, nothing's really lost if you remember where you come from." "Where you come from?" Walter's hand froze halfway to his cup. "The basement." In 50 years, he'd only been down there a handful of times. Sarah had always handled the storage, the old boxes, the family history. Walter threw some money on the table and rushed out, his coffee untouched. The drive home seemed to take hours, though his watch showed only minutes passing. The basement door creaked open, dust dancing in the beam of his flashlight. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended into the musty darkness. Boxes lined the walls, decades of life stored away. Walter moved slowly, reading Sarah's neat handwriting on each one. Christmas decorations 1975, James's school papers, family photos 1960 to 1980, and then, in the furthest corner, a small metal box labeled simply, "Home." Walter's hands shook as he lifted it, decades of dust falling away. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a stack of yellow documents. His grandfather's signature, bold and clear. The original deed, dated 1923. Property tax records going back 50 years. Everything Sarah had kept safe, just like she promised. Walter sank onto an old chair, clutching the papers to his chest as tears rolled down his cheeks. Through the small basement window, he could see the sky beginning to lighten. 32 hours left. But now, finally, he had something to fight with. The roses would have to wait for their morning water. Walter had work to do. He climbed the basement stairs slowly, each step feeling lighter than the last. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Another call from Bill Henderson, no doubt. But this time, Walter didn't answer. He had found his voice again. And tomorrow, the judge would hear it. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the courthouse steps when Walter arrived, the metal box clutched tightly under his arm. A different security guard stood at the entrance, older this time, with gray at his temples. "Court doesn't open for another hour," the guard said, checking his watch. "I'll wait," Walter replied, settling onto the stone steps. The morning air was cool against his face, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang 6 times. A shadow fell across him. Bill Henderson stood there in another expensive suit, his lawyer right beside him. "Brought some light reading, Johnson?" Henderson nodded at the metal box. Walter said nothing, his fingers tightening around the box's handle. "Mr. Johnson," Henderson's lawyer stepped forward. "My client has authorized me to make one final offer before today's hearing. Given the circumstances, we feel it's more than generous." Walter stood up slowly, his knees protesting. "The house isn't for sale." The lawyer smiled thinly. "Everything has a price, Mr. Johnson, especially when the alternative could be costly." More people began arriving as the hour approached. Walter watched as the courthouse came alive, clerks hurrying in with coffee cups, lawyers checking phones, worried-looking people clutching papers just like him. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doors opened. Walter made his way through security, the metal box drawing suspicious looks from the guards. "Need to check that," one said, pointing to an X-ray machine. Walter placed the box on the conveyor belt, his heart pounding as it disappeared into the machine. When it emerged, he grabbed it immediately, checking that nothing had fallen out. Courtroom 3B was already filling up when he arrived. He recognized more faces today, neighbors he'd known for decades, now all sitting on Henderson's side of the room. The whispers followed him as he made his way to the defendant's table. "All rise." Judge Thompson entered, his face already set in a scowl. He sat heavily, shuffling papers without looking up. "Case number 47293 continues," the bailiff announced. "Henderson et al. versus Johnson." "Mr. Johnson." Judge Thompson's voice cut through the air. "I trust you've brought the required documentation?" Walter stood, lifting the metal box onto the table. "Yes, Your Honor. I found—" "Approach the bench and present your documents properly," the judge interrupted. Walter's hands trembled as he opened the box, removing the carefully preserved papers. He walked forward, feeling every eye in the room on his back. "Your Honor," Henderson's lawyer shot to his feet. "Before Mr. Johnson presents anything, we have new evidence that must be considered." The judge waved Walter back to his table without even looking at his documents. "Proceed, counselor." The lawyer strode forward, presenting a thick folder. "Your Honor, we've discovered records indicating the property in question was actually sold in 1968. Mr. Johnson's occupancy appears to be based on an invalid claim." "That's impossible." Walter stood up. "My grandfather—" "Mr. Johnson." Judge Thompson's gavel crashed down. "You will remain silent until addressed." The lawyer continued smoothly, spreading documents across the judge's desk. "As you can see, Your Honor, the deed Mr. Johnson claims to hold was superseded by this sale agreement. The current deed holders are— These documents are false." Walter's voice cracked. "I have the original deed right here." "Bailiff!" Judge Thompson pointed at Walter. "Remove Mr. Johnson from my courtroom until he can control himself." The bailiff moved forward, but Walter held his ground, holding up the yellowed papers from the metal box. "Please, Your Honor, just look at these. They prove—" "One more word, Mr. Johnson, and you'll be held in contempt." The judge's face was red now. "This court will take a 15-minute recess while I review these new documents." The bailiff's hand closed around Walter's arm, pulling him toward his seat. The room spun around him as he watched Judge Thompson leaf through Henderson's papers without even glancing at the metal box on Walter's table. During the recess, Walter sat alone, listening to the whispers behind him. "Did you hear about the sale in '68? Always knew something wasn't right about him living there. About time someone looked into it." When Judge Thompson returned, his face was set in stone. Having reviewed the evidence presented by the plaintiff, he began, not looking at Walter. "This court finds significant questions regarding the property's legal ownership. Furthermore, Mr. Johnson's disruptive behavior shows a disturbing pattern of—" "But my documents—" Walter started to rise. "Silence." The gavel crashed down again. "Mr. Johnson, you leave this court no choice. I am issuing an immediate inspection order. Code enforcement will evaluate the property this afternoon. Additionally, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises pending resolution of ownership." The room went silent. Walter felt his legs give way as he sank into his chair. "Your Honor," Henderson's lawyer stood. "Given Mr. Johnson's behavior, we request police presence during the inspection." "Granted." Judge Thompson was already gathering his papers. Court is adjourned. People began filing out, but Walter couldn't move. The metal box sat open on his table, his grandfather's careful signature clearly visible on the yellowed paper. Papers no one had even looked at. "Time to go, Mr. Johnson." The bailiff's voice was almost gentle. Walter slowly packed the documents back into the box. His fingers brushed against a photograph he hadn't noticed before, his parents standing proud in front of the house, his mother's roses just planted behind them. Outside the courtroom, Henderson stood with his lawyer, both smiling as they shook hands. 24 hours, Johnson," Henderson called out as Walter passed. "Better start packing." The walk back to his car felt like miles. Each step echoed on the marble floors. Each breath seemed to catch in his throat. The security guard at the entrance watched him pass, shaking his head slightly. In the parking lot, Walter sat in his Buick, the metal box heavy in his lap. The morning sun was high now, beating down on the car's roof. He should drive home. The roses needed watering. Code enforcement would be coming, but his hands wouldn't move to the steering wheel. His phone buzzed, a text message. Walter's heart leaped, thinking of James. But it was an unknown number. Better take the offer while you can still get something for that dump. Bill, Walter's vision blurred as he stared at the message. Through the windshield, he watched people coming and going from the courthouse. Lawyers in suits, families hurrying up the steps, justice being served to everyone but him. The metal box seemed to grow heavier in his lap. 50 years of history, of memories, of truth, and none of it mattered. Not here. Not now. A police car pulled into the parking lot, and Walter finally turned the key in the ignition. He had 24 hours left in his home. 24 hours to figure out what to do with a lifetime of memories. 24 hours to say goodbye to Sarah's roses. As he drove home, every traffic light seemed to turn red. Every intersection stretched longer. The city he'd known his whole life suddenly felt foreign, hostile. Bill Henderson's new BMW was already parked in front of his house when Walter pulled up. Next to it, a white van marked City Code Enforcement waited like a vulture. Walter sat in his car, clutching the metal box that held his worthless truth, and watched as strangers prepared to tell him everything that was wrong with the only home he'd ever known. Walter's hands shook as he pulled his house key from his pocket. Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway. "Mr. Johnson?" A woman in a gray uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Susan Martinez from Code Enforcement. We need to begin our inspection." Bill Henderson stood by his BMW, arms crossed, watching with a smirk. "Can I at least go inside first?" Walter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Make it quick," Susan replied, checking her watch. "We're on a schedule." The house felt different now. Every crack in the walls, every worn floorboard seemed to mock him. Walter placed the metal box on Sarah's desk, his fingers lingering on its dusty surface. "Mr. Johnson?" Susan called from the porch. "We need to start now." The inspection began in the front yard. Susan took photos of the roses, making notes on her clipboard. "Overgrown vegetation," she muttered. "Potential habitat for vermin." "Those roses have been here for 30 years, Walter said. "They're not." "Broken shingles on the roof," she continued, ignoring him. "Paint peeling on the trim. Missing gutter section." Bill Henderson had moved closer, pointing things out to the inspector. "Don't forget the cracked sidewalk. And that porch railing's not up to code." Walter watched helplessly as they circled his home like vultures. More neighbors had gathered on the street, watching the spectacle. "Interior inspection now," Susan announced, heading for the front door. Inside, she found more to criticize. Every room held some violation, some flaw that needed documenting. Outdated electrical wiring, probable asbestos in the ceiling tiles, water damage in the bathroom. The list grew longer with each room. Walter followed silently, each note on the clipboard another nail in his coffin. In the kitchen, Susan opened the basement door, flicking on the light. "Wait," Walter stepped forward. "That's private. My wife's things. All areas must be inspected." "Sir," she started down the stairs. A crash from outside made them both jump. Walter rushed to the window. 3 teenage boys were running away, laughing. On his front lawn, Sarah's favorite ceramic planter lay shattered. "Hey!" Walter shouted, running outside. "Stop!" But they were already gone. Bill Henderson stood watching, beer in hand. "Shame about the vandalism," he said, not bothering to hide his smile. "Neighborhood's not as safe as it used to be." Walter's hands clenched into fists. A police car rolled by slowly, the officer inside watching him with suspicious eyes. Back inside, Susan was finishing her inspection. Her clipboard was full of notes, none of them good. Based on preliminary findings, she read from her form, "This property has multiple code violations requiring immediate attention. Given the extent of necessary repairs and safety concerns, I'm recommending the property be declared." "Please," Walter interrupted. "Just give me time. I can fix. My recommendation will be submitted to the court tomorrow morning." She headed for the door, then paused. "You might want to start packing, Mr. Johnson. These decisions usually move pretty fast." The front door closed behind her. Walter stood in his living room, surrounded by 50 years of memories, all now reduced to a list of violations. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello, Dad." Walter's heart stopped. "James?" "Yeah, I got your messages." His son's voice sounded distant, uncomfortable. "Look about the house. They're trying to take it, son. Your mother's home. I need. Maybe it's for the best, Dad." The words hit Walter like a physical blow. "What? Mom's gone. The house is old. You could get a nice apartment, somewhere easier to manage. I could help you look." "This is your home," Walter whispered. "You learned to walk in this living room. Your mother's roses. They're just roses, Dad. Just a house. Let it go." The line went dead. Walter stared at the phone, his son's words echoing in his head. Outside, an engine roared to life, the code enforcement van leaving. Bill Henderson's voice drifted through the open window as he talked on his phone. "Yeah, it's done. Inspector found everything we said she would. Old man won't last another day." Walter walked to Sarah's desk, picking up their wedding photo. They'd taken it right there in the garden, the roses just starting to bloom behind them. A rock crashed through the living room window. Walter ducked as glass sprayed across the floor. More laughter from outside, more running footsteps. The phone rang again. Another unknown number. "Mr. Johnson? This is Patricia Myers from the courthouse again. Judge Thompson has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning regarding the code violations. Attendance is mandatory." Walter couldn't answer. He just stood there, surrounded by broken glass, holding the photo of his wedding day. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the broken window. In the garden, Sarah's roses swayed in the evening breeze, oblivious to the chaos around them. Another police car drove by, then another. Walter sat in Sarah's chair, the wedding photo in his lap, and watched darkness fall on the only home he'd ever known. Tomorrow morning, they would take it all away. The house, the memories, the roses. Everything Sarah had loved, everything they'd built together. His phone buzzed one last time. A text from Bill Henderson. "Final offer, $50,000. Take it or leave with nothing. Your choice, old man." Walter looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the wedding photo, at Sarah's smile, at the roses blooming behind them. Slowly, carefully, he placed the photo back on the desk. Then he walked to the kitchen and found Sarah's old notepad, the one she used for grocery lists and phone messages. With trembling hands, he wrote 2 words, "Not selling." He placed the note on the broken window, weighing it down with a piece of glass. Let them read it. Let them all read it. Then Walter Johnson, teacher, husband, homeowner, sat in the growing darkness of his living room and waited for morning to come. The roses would need watering one last time. Dawn crept through the broken window, scattering light across the glass-strewn floor. Walter hadn't slept. His suit was wrinkled from sitting in Sarah's chair all night, but he didn't bother changing. It wouldn't matter anyway. The roses needed water. One last time. Outside, the morning air was crisp. Walter's shoes crunched on scattered glass as he made his way to the garden hose. The ceramic planter still lay shattered on the lawn. Final inspection. Old man? Bill Henderson stood at his fence, fresh coffee in hand, watching Walter water the roses. Walter kept working, moving from bush to bush, making sure each one got enough water. Sarah had always said roses were like people. They needed care and attention to thrive. "Court starts in an hour," Henderson called out. "Need a ride? Your car's looking pretty old. Would hate for you to break down on your last trip to the courthouse." The water ran out. Walter coiled the hose slowly, deliberately. Then he turned to face Henderson. "You know, Bill," he said quietly, "Sarah always said you were lonely. That's why you watched us so much. She felt sorry for you." Henderson's face reddened. "Yeah? Well, where's Sarah now?" Walter walked inside without answering. The metal box sat on Sarah's desk where he'd left it. He picked it up, along with the wedding photo, and headed for his car. The courthouse seemed bigger today, more imposing. The same security guard from yesterday watched Walter place the metal box on the x-ray belt. "Good luck in there," the guard said softly as Walter passed. Courtroom 3B was already packed. The wooden bench creaked as Walter sat down. He could hear the whispers behind him. "Did you see the inspection report? Total dump. Should have been condemned years ago. Can't believe he's still fighting." The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Richard Thompson presiding. Judge Thompson stormed in, his face already red with irritation. He sat heavily, glaring at the papers before him. Case number 47293, the bailiff announced. Emergency hearing regarding code violations. Mr. Johnson. Judge Thompson's voice dripped with contempt. I have before me the code enforcement report. 27 violations. 27. Do you have any idea of the liability you've created? The danger to the community? Walter stood slowly. Your Honor, if I could just... Furthermore, the judge continued, I have affidavits from multiple neighbors reporting suspicious activity, potential criminal elements. That's a lie. Walter's voice rang out stronger than he intended. The gavel crashed down. One more outburst, and you'll be removed. Now, given the severity of these violations and the previous questions regarding ownership, this court has no choice but to order immediate. Please, Walter stepped forward. Those are my wife's roses. Bailiff. Judge Thompson pointed. Remove him. My grandfather built that house. Walter's voice rose as the bailiff approached. My son took his first steps there. My Sarah. I said remove him. The bailiff grabbed Walter's arm, but he pulled away. You want to know why they're doing this? Walter gestured at Henderson and his lawyer. Because we're the last ones. The last old house, the last old family, the last piece of the neighborhood they can't control. That's enough. Judge Thompson stood, his robe billowing. No, it's not enough. Walter's voice filled the courtroom. You haven't even looked at my documents. You haven't listened to a word I've said. You just see an old black man and decide he doesn't belong. The courtroom fell silent. Even the bailiff's grip loosened. How dare you? Judge Thompson's face was purple now. I'll have you jailed for contempt. Go ahead. Walter spread his arms. Jail me. Take my home. Take everything. But you can't take the truth. You can't take what's right. Your Honor. Henderson's lawyer stood smoothly. Given Mr. Johnson's clearly unstable state. Unstable? Walter laughed, a harsh sound that surprised even him. I'm the only sane one here. The only one who sees what this really is. That's it. Judge Thompson roared. Bailiff, remove him and... Your Honor, I'd like to intervene. A new voice cut through the chaos. A young man stood up from the gallery, straightening his tie as he moved forward. And you are? Judge Thompson demanded. Michael Bennett, Your Honor, licensed to practice in Tennessee, and I'd like to enter an appearance as counsel for Mr. Johnson. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Henderson's lawyer stepped forward, but Bennett held up a hand. Before you continue, Your Honor, I should inform you that I've been recording these proceedings, and I've noticed several irregularities that I believe the State Bar Association would find interesting. Judge Thompson's face went from purple to white. This is highly irregular. So is refusing to examine evidence, Bennett replied calmly. So is rushing emergency hearings without proper notice. So is, quite frankly, the blatant discrimination I've witnessed in this courtroom. The bailiff's hand fell away from Walter's arm. Henderson and his lawyer were whispering furiously. Furthermore, Bennett continued, pulling out his phone, I've taken the liberty of contacting several media outlets. They're very interested in this story, particularly given Judge Thompson's history with similar cases. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Walter stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. I move for an immediate stay of all proceedings, Bennett said, his voice firm. And I request a full hearing, with proper examination of all evidence, before a different judge. Judge Thompson's hands were shaking as he shuffled his papers. This is a clear violation of due process? Yes, it is. Bennett smiled. Shall I continue listing the violations I've observed, Your Honor? Perhaps the Bar Association would be interested in... Motion granted. Judge Thompson's gavel fell weakly. Case continued pending reassignment. Court adjourned. The judge practically ran from the courtroom. Henderson and his lawyer hurried out a side door, avoiding the reporters already gathering in the hallway. Walter stood at the defendant's table, his legs weak. Bennett approached, holding out his hand. Mr. Johnson, let's talk about those documents of yours. And then, if you don't mind, I'd like to see these roses I've heard so much about. Walter looked at the young lawyer's outstretched hand. Then he looked at the metal box on the table, at Sarah's wedding photo. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. The roses need watering, he said. Sarah always said a garden needs daily care. Bennett picked up the metal box. Then let's make sure you're there to water them. For a long time to come. Together, they walked out of courtroom 3B, past the reporters, past the whispers, past the security guard who gave Walter a small nod. The morning sun was bright on the courthouse steps. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. It was time to go home. The roses were waiting. The roses swayed in the afternoon breeze as Michael Bennett knelt in Walter's garden, examining the bushes carefully. "These are prize-winning roses, Mr. Johnson," he said, gently touching a white bloom. "My grandmother used to grow them too. American Beauty, right?" Walter nodded. The watering can steady in his hands now. "Sarah ordered them special from a catalog in 1985. Said our garden deserved the best." Inside, papers from the metal box covered Sarah's desk. Bennett had spent the last hour examining each document, making notes on his laptop. "Mr. Johnson," he called from the open window. "Could you come in for a moment? There's something you need to see." Walter gave the roses one last splash of water before heading inside. The broken window was now covered with plywood. Bennett had called someone to fix it as soon as they'd arrived from court. "Look at this," Bennett pointed to his laptop screen. "I've been doing some research on Judge Thompson's cases over the past decade. You're not the first homeowner he's tried to force out, but you might be the last." A series of newspaper articles filled the screen. Different names, different houses, but the same story. Elderly homeowners, sudden code violations, rushed hearings, forced sales. And look who shows up in every case. Bennett scrolled through property records. Highland Development, LLC. Care to guess who owns that company? Bill Henderson, Walter said quietly. Among others, including Judge Thompson's brother-in-law. Bennett's fingers flew over the keyboard. They've been doing this for years. Buy up old houses cheap. Tear them down, build luxury condos. But they got sloppy with your case. Too rushed, too obvious. A car drove by slowly outside. A news van, the third one that hour. "They're going to want to talk to you," Bennett said, nodding toward the window. "Your story is getting attention. But first, we need to file some papers." Walter sat in Sarah's chair, watching as Bennett drafted documents on his laptop. The young lawyer's tie was loose now, his sleeves rolled up. "Remember what you said in court today?" Bennett asked, still typing. "About being the last ones?" "That's exactly what this is about. They want to erase the old neighborhood, the history, the community. But they didn't count on you standing up to them." The phone rang. Walter checked the caller ID. "James." "Dad." His son's voice was different now, worried. "I just saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, son. Better than fine. I'm sorry about what I said before. About selling. I didn't understand." "It's okay, James. You didn't know. But I should have. Mom's roses. The house where I grew up." James paused. "I'm catching the next flight to Memphis." Walter's hand tightened on the receiver. "You're coming home?" "Yeah, Dad. I'm coming home." After he hung up, Walter found Bennett standing by Sarah's desk, holding the wedding photo. "Your wife had a beautiful smile," he said, carefully placing the photo back down. "She must have really loved these roses." "She loved everything about this house," Walter replied. "Said it wasn't just walls and a roof. It was a piece of history." "Our history," Bennett nodded, turning back to his laptop. "Well, let's make sure that history is preserved. I filed for an emergency injunction against any further action by Thompson or Highland Development. But we're not stopping there." More cars were gathering outside now. Reporters, photographers, curious onlookers. Through the window, Walter could see Margaret Wilson from next door, wringing her hands as she paced on her front porch. "Mr. Johnson," Bennett called from the desk, "could you come verify some dates for me?" But before Walter could move, there was a knock at the door. Through the glass, he could see Bill Henderson standing on his porch, his face red, his lawyer hovering nervously behind him. "Don't answer it," Bennett said, already reaching for his phone. "No," Walter stood up straight. "I need to do this." He opened the door. Henderson barged in without waiting for an invitation. "Listen, Johnson," he started, then stopped short when he saw Bennett. "What's he doing here?" "Mr. Henderson," Bennett smiled coldly. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing Highland Development's history of property acquisition. Care to comment?" "This is harassment," Henderson's lawyer stepped forward. We'll file. No. Henderson cut him off. Johnson, listen. This can still end quietly. Name your price. Whatever you want, double it. Just call off your dog and... My name, Walter's voice was firm, is Mr. Johnson. And this house isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Henderson's face was getting redder. We have connections. We have... A corrupt judge? Bennett offered. Fraudulent documents? Tell me, Mr. Henderson, how long has Highland Development been bribing officials to force out homeowners? Henderson's lawyer grabbed his arm. Bill, don't say another word. We need to go. But Henderson jerked away. You think you've won something here, old man? You think this changes anything? This neighborhood doesn't want you here. You don't belong. Actually, a new voice called from the doorway. He does belong here. Margaret Wilson stood in the open doorway, her hands no longer wringing. I remember when the Johnsons moved in, she said, stepping into the house. I remember every document Sarah showed me, every permit they filed. And I'm ready to testify about it. About everything. Behind her, other neighbors were gathering on the porch. Old faces Walter hadn't seen in years, people who'd been afraid to speak up before. Get out of my house, Bill, Walter said quietly. And take your offers with you. Henderson looked around wildly, seeing the cameras starting to gather outside, the neighbors on the porch, the confident smile on Bennett's face. This isn't over, he snarled, backing toward the door. Actually, Bennett called after him. It is. Check your email, Mr. Henderson. The FBI is very interested in Highland Development's business practices. After they left, the house fell quiet. Walter could hear the roses rustling in the breeze through the broken window, the sound of reporters talking outside, the steady click of Bennett's laptop keys. Mr. Johnson, Bennett looked up from his screen. Are you ready to tell your story? Really tell it? Walter looked around the room, at Sarah's desk, at their wedding photo, at the metal box full of truth that had finally been heard. Yes, he said. I believe I am. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the roses in the garden. They seemed to glow, their petals bright against the dark earth where Sarah had planted them so many years ago. Walter Johnson stood in his home, surrounded by neighbors who had found their courage, preparing to tell a story that needed to be heard. The truth, like Sarah's roses, had finally bloomed. The morning newspaper sat on Walter's kitchen table, his own face staring back at him from the front page. Corruption exposed. Local judge under investigation in housing scandal, the headline screamed. Don't read the comments online, Michael Bennett advised, pouring himself another cup of coffee. He'd practically moved into Walter's dining room over the past week, turning it into a makeshift law office. A knock at the door made them both look up. James stood there, suitcase still in hand. Dad? Walter crossed the room in 3 steps, pulling his son into a tight embrace. James dropped his suitcase, hugging back just as hard. I'm sorry, James whispered. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. Bennett quietly excused himself to the back porch, giving father and son privacy. Through the window, Walter could see him on his phone, probably talking to reporters again. You've got gray hair, Walter said, touching his son's temple. James laughed, wiping his eyes. Yeah, well, you should see my students. Teaching high school gives you gray hair fast. Just like your old man, Walter smiled. Come on, let me show you something. They walked to Sarah's garden, where the roses were blooming brighter than ever. The broken planter had been replaced. Margaret Wilson had brought over one of her own, insisting it was just gathering dust in her garage anyway. Mom would love this, James said softly, touching a white petal. Mr. Johnson, Bennett called from the porch. They've arrested Thompson. The next few hours were a blur. The news vans returned, cameras rolling as FBI agents led Judge Thompson out of the courthouse in handcuffs. Bill Henderson was nowhere to be seen, but his lawyer was photographed entering the FBI field office. They found everything, Bennett explained, spreading newspapers across the dining room table. Fake documents, bribes, offshore accounts. Thompson was getting kickbacks from every property Highland Development acquired. How many homes? James asked. Dozens, Bennett replied grimly. Over the past decade, they forced out at least 30 families. Mostly elderly, mostly minority homeowners. But your father's case broke it wide open. Walter sat in Sarah's chair, watching his son and the young lawyer pore over documents. On the TV in the corner, news anchors were discussing the case, showing photos of the other families who'd lost their homes. Another knock at the door. This time it was Tommy Wilson, Margaret's son. "Mr. Johnson?" He looked nervous. "Mom wanted me to give you this." He handed over a thick folder, stuffed with papers. "What's this?" Walter asked. "Records," Tommy explained. "Mom kept copies of everything, all the permits and documents from when you and Mrs. Johnson first moved in. She was afraid to show them before because of my garage permit, but now—" Bennett was already flipping through the folder, his eyes widening. "This is gold. Proof of continuous residence, original property surveys, everything." More neighbors started arriving throughout the day. Old Mr. Parker from down the street brought photos from block parties in the 1980s, showing Walter and Sarah's house in the background. Mrs. Chun from the corner store had receipt books going back 20 years, documenting Walter's daily purchases. "Remember when Sarah would send me for her garden supplies?" Walter asked Mrs. Chun, who was sitting at his kitchen table now, drinking tea. "Every spring," she smiled. "Always the same order. Plant food, garden twine, new gloves." The living room was full of people now, sharing stories, looking at old photos. James sat with Tommy Wilson, laughing about childhood pranks. Bennett moved from group to group, taking statements, building their case stronger with each conversation. Walter's phone rang, the district attorney's office. "Mr. Johnson, we're reviewing Judge Thompson's cases. We'd like you to testify before the grand jury next week." "I'll be there," Walter said firmly. As he hung up, he heard a commotion outside. Through the window, he could see Bill Henderson being led out of his house in handcuffs, reporters swarming his front lawn. "Federal agents found the smoking gun," Bennett announced, reading from his phone. "Emails between Henderson and Thompson, planning the whole thing. They've been targeting historic homes for years, manipulating property values, forcing sales." "What happens to the other families?" Walter asked. "The ones who lost their homes?" Bennett smiled. "That's the best part. The DA's office is setting up a special task force. Every case Thompson handled is being reviewed. There's talk of restitution, maybe even property restoration where possible." James put his hand on Walter's shoulder. "You did this, Dad. You stood up to them." Walter shook his head. "We all did this. Everyone in this room, everyone who kept records, who remembered, who finally spoke up." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the crowded living room. In the garden, Sarah's roses swayed in the breeze, their petals catching the light. Mrs. Chun was showing Bennett her receipt books. "See here? Every purchase, every date. I knew something wasn't right when they started pressuring people to sell." Tommy Wilson and his mother were going through old photos. "Look, there's you and James playing basketball in the driveway." The TV was still on, showing footage of Thompson and Henderson in custody. But no one was watching anymore. They were too busy sharing stories, piecing together the history of their neighborhood, one memory at a time. "Mr. Johnson?" A young reporter stood at the door. "Would you like to make a statement about the arrests?" Walter looked around his living room, at his son, at his neighbors, at the young lawyer who'd helped him fight back. At Sarah's desk, where their wedding photo still sat, her smile as bright as ever. "Yes," he said, "I would." He walked onto his front porch, where cameras and microphones waited. But before he could speak, Margaret Wilson stepped forward. "Let me tell you about my neighbors, the Johnsons," she began. "Let me tell you about 50 years of love and care, about roses that bloom every spring, about a home that means more than just property values." One by one, the neighbors joined her, each adding their piece to the story. Walter stood among them, listening as their voices rose together, strong and clear in the afternoon sun. Justice had finally come to their street, and it sounded like the truth being told, at last, by those who had always known it. The courthouse felt different now. Walter's shoes clicked on the marble floor as he walked to courtroom 3B, but this time he wasn't alone. James walked beside him, and behind them came a stream of neighbors, each carrying their own pieces of neighborhood history. The new judge, Patricia Martinez, looked nothing like Thompson. She sat straight in her chair, her eyes alert as she reviewed the final documentation. In the matter of Johnson versus Highland Development, she began, her voice clear and strong. This court has reviewed all evidence presented, including the extensive documentation of fraud and corruption in previous proceedings. Walter sat at the plaintiff's table now, Michael Bennett beside him. Across the aisle, Highland Development's new lawyers looked uncomfortable. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, given the criminal convictions of former Judge Thompson and William Henderson, along with the established pattern of discriminatory practices, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The gavel fell, but it wasn't a crash this time. It was the sound of justice, clean and clear. Mr. Johnson's property rights are hereby confirmed and protected. Additionally, Highland Development is ordered to pay restitution in the amount of... Walter barely heard the number. He was looking at Sarah's wedding photo, which he'd brought with him one last time. Her smile seemed brighter today. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered again, but they weren't just interested in Walter anymore. Other families were coming forward, telling their stories of homes lost to Thompson and Henderson's scheme. "Dad," James touched his arm. "They want to know if you'll help with the community restoration project." The project had been Bennett's idea, using the restitution money to help displaced families return, to restore historic homes, to preserve the neighborhood's character and history. "Of course I'll help," Walter said. Sarah would have wanted that. Back home, the roses were blooming stronger than ever. The garden had become a symbol now. Reporters used it in their stories, calling it the garden that justice grew. Walter thought Sarah would have laughed at that. "Mr. Johnson?" A small group waited by his front gate. Elderly couples, young families, all holding papers and photos. "Could you help us with our cases? Show us how you fought back." Walter looked at their faces, tired, hopeful, determined. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror not so long ago. "Come in," he said, opening the gate. "Let's talk on the porch." The roses make everything clearer. They sat in chairs Margaret Wilson had brought over, drinking Mrs. Chen's tea, sharing their stories. Bennett worked from Sarah's desk, taking notes, building new cases. "Tell them about the documents, Dad." James called from the garden, where he was teaching Tommy Wilson's kids how to prune roses. "Tell them how Mom kept everything." So Walter told them. About Sarah's careful records, about the metal box in the basement, about the importance of keeping history alive. As he talked, he could see hope returning to their eyes. The phone rang. The mayor's office. They wanted Walter to chair a new community preservation committee. "We need your experience," the mayor's aide said. "Your voice." Walter agreed, but not before making one condition. The committee would meet in his garden, among Sarah's roses. Days turned into weeks. The headlines about Thompson and Henderson faded, replaced by stories of families returning, homes being restored, communities healing. Walter's porch became a gathering place. Every morning, people would come by with papers to review, cases to discuss, or sometimes just to sit and watch the roses grow. "You've started something here," Bennett said one evening, looking up from his laptop. He'd kept his own office downtown, but still worked from Sarah's desk most days. "This is bigger than one house now." Walter nodded, watching James teach another group of neighbors about rose care. His son had taken a leave from his teaching job, decided to stay and help with the restoration project. "Sarah always said a garden needs tending," Walter replied. "Turns out a community's the same way." The street had changed. Not in the way Henderson had planned, with luxury condos and generic storefronts, but in a deeper way. Neighbors talked to each other again. Front porches came back to life. Gardens bloomed in yards that had been empty for years. Margaret Wilson organized a neighborhood history project, collecting stories and photos from every family. Mrs. Chen's store became a community hub, its walls covered with old photographs and news clippings. "Mr. Johnson?" A young couple stood at his gate, looking nervous. "We just bought the Peterson place. We heard you could tell us about its history." Walter smiled, gesturing to his porch chairs. "Come sit. Let me tell you about this neighborhood, about the people who built it, who loved it, who fought for it." As he talked, more neighbors gathered. They added their own stories, their own memories. The young couple listened, their eyes wide, as the history of their new home came alive. The sun was setting now, painting the roses gold. James brought out more of Mrs. Chen's tea. Bennett looked up from his papers occasionally, smiling as he listened to the story's flow. Walter sat in Sarah's old porch chair, watching his community rebuild itself stronger than before. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, their fragrance filling the air. "You were right, Sarah," he whispered. "A garden needs daily care. But so does justice. So does community. So does love." The metal box sat on Sarah's desk, its contents now part of official records, part of history. But more importantly, its contents had become part of the future, a blueprint for fighting back, for standing up, for preserving what matters. As darkness fell, the porch lights came on up and down the street. Neighbors called good night to each other. Children played in front yards. Music drifted from open windows. Walter Johnson, teacher, husband, fighter, picked up his watering can one last time that day. The roses needed their evening drink. But as he watered, he wasn't just tending Sarah's garden anymore. He was tending hope, tending justice, tending the legacy that would bloom long after he was gone. The roses would make sure of that.